What is the point of having an infallible church if it can't tell me what the Bible means? That's the question we're going to be looking at here today. I'm Doug Beaumont. Let's jump into it. Now, first things first, it is true that the Catholic Church does not have an infallible Bible commentary. In fact, not only does the Catholic Church not have an infallible Bible commentary, it doesn't even have an official list that I know of all the verses that it has interpreted infallibly. Hours of Googling produced a couple of different lists alleging that the Catholic Church has only interpreted a certain number of Bible verses infallibly. These ranged from about 7 to 15 verses. Now, the number was a little higher than that because sometimes these lists included numerous verses in the same topic. Now, what I ended up with, from the best sources I could find, were 25 individual Bible verses that at least have been claimed to have been infallibly interpreted. Those 25 verses, though, really only cover about 16 topics, and there's a couple of them that I'm really not too sure about. So the number of verses infallibly interpreted by the Catholic Church is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 15. Let's just stick with that. The actual number is not really that important. What is important is why the Catholic Church hasn't infallibly interpreted more. By the way, I'm going to be putting links in my video description below telling you the sources that I used to produce this video, and also a link to my website, douglasbeaumont.com, where you can find the charts that I just posted. Now, as a former Protestant, I feel the force of this desire for the Church to interpret the Bible for me. Over the years as an evangelical, I collected numerous Bible commentaries, and I remember every time I needed to do work on a particular verse or passage, having to go through all these different commentaries and try to figure out which ones were most likely correct. I remember a teacher one time saying that you know you have researched enough commentaries when you find the one that agrees with you. So I get it. When Protestants complain that this so-called infallible church that you need in order to understand the Bible and avoid illicit private interpretation doesn't actually seem to have very many infallible interpretations of verses, what's the point? A good example of this comes from Matt Slick over at Good Ol' Carm. He asks, how many verses of the Bible has the Roman Catholic Church infallibly interpreted? Because, as he notes, if the Church hasn't infallibly interpreted a verse, then its interpretations are fallible, just like the Protestants. Shouldn't the Church then infallibly interpret Scripture and declare to the world exactly what verses mean? Now, sometimes this issue is raised when a Catholic attacks a Protestant for their private interpretation of the Bible. If a Protestant brings up a Bible verse that seems contrary to Catholic teaching, the Catholic can just say, well, that's just your fallible private interpretation. But if the Catholic himself doesn't have an infallible interpretation, doesn't that put them on the same footing? Well, here I'm going to explain that while it would seem nice to have an infallible Bible commentary, it's really not necessary. First, I want to address this issue of private interpretation. Is it the case that the Catholic can just read the Bible, come up with any interpretation that they want as long as it sounds biblical, and then run with it? Well, the answer is no. Because once a Bible verse is interpreted, we now have a teaching. And although the Catholic Church might not have infallibly interpreted that particular verse for all time and all places, what it has done is defined orthodoxy. It's defined the limits that people are allowed to go when it comes to teaching about faith and morals. So the Catholic cannot go outside of that orthodox sphere with their understanding of Bible verses. Protestant, on the other hand, who comes up with some reading of Scripture that is in disagreement with their church is free to just leave or start their own church. And this is because Protestants don't believe that they or their churches are infallible. So the best they ever can do are the best fallible interpretations that they can come up with. So even if the Catholic Church only has 7, 15, or 25 passages infallibly interpreted, that's 7 or 15 or 25 more than the Protestant does. So what are the reasons for the Church not producing an infallible commentary? Well, for one, there's a practical issue with producing such a thing. There are well over 30,000 verses in the Bible, and many of them, if not all of them, teach multiple things. Now, that's not to say that they have multiple meanings, especially contrary ones. What it means is that these verses have so much that can be said about them that if someone is going to produce a commentary, they really need to try to say as much as they possibly can. So just imagine the massive library one would have to create in order to have an infallible commentary on every verse of the Bible, especially if it is supposed to be exhaustive in any way. Now, this practical problem is only multiplied by an interpretive issue. As most Bible scholars have recognized, even if a text only has a certain literal meaning, it can have multiple senses. The church has identified at least 4. You have the literal sense, which is just the basic meaning, the facts of the verse. Then you have the allegorical or the typological sense that is kind of writing underneath the literal sense. We see this, for example, in Galatians 4:22 through 26. Then there is the tropological sense, which has to do with any moral teachings that we can get from a certain passage. We see this in 1 Corinthians 10:11. And we have the anagogical sense, which looks toward the end of time and looks for hints hiding under the literal sense of certain passages that actually point to something in our future. We see this, for example, in Hebrews 12:22 through 23. So right away, if you've got 30,000 verses, you've got probably 120,000 different senses that you're going to have to comment on. Then you have to multiply those by the particular and personal applications of those verses. So simply knowing what a verse means doesn't tell you how to apply it in every situation. Further, any verse that produces a teaching principle is then going to have to be applied to particulars. And this is basically open-ended when it comes to Scripture. So beyond the practical difficulties, if not impossibilities, of producing an infallible, exhaustive commentary, is the danger of appearing to be exhaustive when you're really not. That is to say, we don't want to appear to have limited the possible understandings of a particular passage, such that we cannot add in new insights, answer new questions, or deal with new issues as time goes on. Doctrinal development is a real thing, and so are biblical studies. Now, you might say, well, that may all be true, but the church did manage to put together a catechism. I got my new Ascension Press catechism right here with this cool new cover that my mom got me for Christmas. Links in the description below. So the question might be that if the church is able to codify theology, even though theology develops, why can't it do the same thing with an infallible Bible commentary? Well, besides the practical problem and the interpretive issue, we also need to deal with a theological subject, and that is infallibility itself. Infallibility is more of a negative power, or property, or charism, whatever you want to call it. Infallibility protects the church from making errors in the areas of faith and morals, and it does so under very specific conditions. What infallibility does not do is provide brand new insights or revelation. Now, the job of the church's magisterium is to draw that hedge around orthodoxy to make sure that what is being taught is not false. It is not the job of the magisterium to go through the Bible and pronounce on what every single verse means. And if you think about it, the assumption that that is what the magisterium should be doing is itself a very Protestant assumption. It's a Protestant way of thinking. Because for the Protestant, the Bible alone is sort of the source book for theology. They create their own theologies out of their own understandings of Scripture. So when two Protestants disagree about interpretation, it would be really convenient if the church, a single church, could tell them which one is right. And eventually you'd get rid of all the Protestant denominations and you would just have one Protestant church. However, when we see that infallibility makes it possible for the church to safeguard the deposit of faith, the faith once for all delivered to the saints, we can see why that isn't necessarily granting the ability to perform perfect and exhaustive exegesis on every verse of the Bible. Now, that does not mean that the church doesn't understand what the Bible teaches. And that is because what is being safeguarded are the teachings. so long as an understanding of the Bible is not contrary to what the faith teaches. There is an open-endedness then in biblical studies. There's room for more insights. There's room for applying principles to new particulars that come along. And that is why, even with the verses that have been interpreted infallibly, what you actually have are usually more like negative declarations that say if somebody denies this certain truth is taught here, let them be anathema. The church is not saying this is what the verse means and this is only what it means, and you can't say it means anything else. So often we are told what a scripture verse doesn't mean instead of what it does mean. The rich nature of scripture, its many senses and applications, preclude simple, positive, interpretive declarations. So the church is avoiding biblical interpretive errors not by declaring what every single verse means, but simply saying that it can't mean certain things. And that is not that hard to discover. That's when the catechism comes into play. That's when the 255 or so infallible dogmas come in. And the reason this is so important is that in the end, one's interpretation of a given passage is not as important as the theological or moral conclusions that they come to believe. And it is in those areas where infallibility operates that the church has created its doctrinal system. It is something that is fairly easy to access, and it does the job it was meant to do, which is to protect from error of faith and morals, and not to simply teach everything anyone might want to know. If you want to see the list that I came up with based on my research, again, click the link below. Go to my website, douglasbeaumont.com, and there are also links in the description of this video below if you want to check them out for yourself. Alright, I hope this video has helped you out. If it has, give it a like, and subscribe to Douglas Beaumont if you are into Christian theology, apologetics, and philosophy. Until next time, God bless.